Peter Victor is an economist who has worked on environmental issues for over 40 years as an academic, public servant, and consultant. In the 60s, he wrote his first book entitled Pollution, Economy, and Environment. A professor in environmental studies at York University, Dr. Victor currently chairs the Ontario Greenbelt Advisory Council, is a member of the board of the David Suzuki Foundation, the Advisory Committee on the National Accounts for Statistics Canada, the board of the New Economy Institute, and the advisory panel of True Cost.
Well, there are two main streams of argument in the growth debate. The first is that economic growth entails increasing material and energy throughput, which cannot be sustained given the limits of the planet. And the second, I think quite distinct stream of argument is that economic growth can become uneconomic when the costs of growth exceed the benefits. The proposition that unending economic growth might be undesirable as well as infeasible goes back at least as far as John Stuart Mill, and he gave social, economic, environmental, and spiritual reasons for why he hoped, and I'm going to quote him now, he said, "For the sake of posterity, that they will be content to be stationary long before necessity compels them to it." That's a quote from 1848. Coming forward about 100 years, we find a rather sadly obscure economist called Leopold Kohr, who wrote a book entitled Overdeveloped Nations. He included his own statistical analysis, which by his calculation showed that living standards began to decline in the USA around 1950. Daly has a number of arguments. I want to highlight two. One is, he says, unlike in microeconomics, which has all sorts of principles which determine the optimum scale, the optimum capacity of the activity, there's no equivalent rule in macroeconomics. As he puts it, there's no when to stop rule in relation to the macroeconomy, the implicit assumption being that it can grow forever because it's not growing into anything. Once we realize, of course, that the macroeconomy is embedded in the biosphere, we know that that's not a reasonable perspective. Daly has also argued that in the USA and other rich economies, growth has indeed become uneconomic. I've been struck over the last little while by three graphs developed by totally different people and organizations using very, very different metrics, which all look very similar and I think convey much the same message. The first is the very well-known graph of the ecological footprint at the global level, which began to exceed world biocapacity around 1980. And as we all understand, degradation of nature and biocapacity entails costs that are not captured in GDP, our standard measure of economic output and where we look for economic growth. The second graph, which has a very similar pattern, is the one of the genuine progress indicator, drawn most commonly for the USA, but very similar graphs have been drawn up for a variety of developed countries. And what this graph shows is that whereas, generally speaking, gross domestic product per capita has continued to increase from ever since the data was being collected. In the US, it goes back to the mid-40s. Other countries, a little more recently, you've had that with ups and downs, but broadly a steady increase in GDP per capita. But when you look at the genuine progress indicator per capita, it starts to level off around the mid-70s. And unlike GDP, the genuine progress indicator is sensitive to increasing inequality. It's sensitive to environmental degradation. It values unpaid work and looks at increased leisure. It makes other changes too. So here's a graph where you've got growth going up, but well-being, as measured by the GPI, not doing the same thing. And the third graph, again, a very similar pattern, is where you see GDP per capita graphed against responses to surveys about how happy people think they are. And the most frequently cited graph of this sort shows that the percentage of Americans who describe themselves as very happy has remained essentially constant since the mid-1970s. So you have three very different ways of looking at, on the one hand, economic growth, on the other, indications that we're not getting better off as a result of it. We do have to live within planetary and regional boundaries, so we do need degrowth in throughput, and I believe that rich countries should take the lead. We've also got to reduce economic growth as we conventionally define it, and I'm glad to say that some of the work I've done on scenarios show that we may quite well be able to have high levels of employment, reduce poverty, reduce our environmental impact, all factors which increase well-being, which is what really counts, and where growth remains important.